Welcome to Sherlock Tales, where every mystery comes alive. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, give this video a like, and share it with your fellow mystery lovers. Tell us in the comments, which part of the world are you watching from? Let's solve mysteries together.
On a particularly damp and melancholy November morning, a fine drizzle blurred the gaslights along Baker Street, turning their familiar glow into ghostly halos that hovered mournfully in the mist. From our sitting room windows at number 221B, I watched London stir reluctantly beneath the sombre pall. It seemed precisely the sort of day destined to bring trouble to our doorstep. Sherlock Holmes, however, paid scant attention to the weather or its ominous implications. He sat hunched in his armchair, his keen grey eyes locked upon the morning edition of the Times, periodically muttering disapprovingly at something he evidently found distasteful within its pages. "Really, Watson?" Holmes remarked without looking up. "It astounds me daily that Scotland Yard manages to maintain the smallest shred of public respect. They seem utterly incapable of grasping even the simplest principles of deduction." "What have they overlooked this time?" I asked with a slight smile. Experience had taught me Holmes found no greater pleasure than criticizing Inspector Lestrade and his colleagues, even if they often later benefited from his insights. "The locked room murder in Belgrave Square," Holmes said with a sigh of exaggerated frustration. "Lord Aldridge, found dead inside his own library, door locked from the inside, windows securely fastened, and not a shred of evidence to implicate anyone, save the hapless maid who discovered him. Scotland Yard, in their infinite wisdom, have wasted no time arresting her." "Do you suspect the maid is innocent, then?" Holmes glanced up sharply, a faint glimmer of amusement in his eyes. "My dear Watson, I suspect nothing without facts. However, the account in the paper alone is enough to reveal that this case is hardly the open and shut affair Lestrade believes it to be. The locked room is a puzzle that demands more than the facile explanations offered thus far." Even as Holmes spoke, a frantic knock rattled the front door below, breaking our conversation abruptly. A moment later, Mrs. Hudson appeared at our sitting-room door, a look of mild distress crossing her usually composed face. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said breathlessly. "There's a young woman downstairs in quite a state. She insists she must speak with you immediately." "Who is she?" I asked, rising from my chair in anticipation. Mrs. Hudson hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "It seems, gentlemen, she's the maid from the Aldridge household, the one accused of murder." Holmes's eyes lit with a sudden intensity. He sprang energetically from his chair, discarding the Times carelessly onto the floor. "Splendid timing, Mrs. Hudson. Bring her up at once." Moments later, a pale and frightened young woman stepped nervously into the room, her modest attire and trembling hands betraying her distress. She was scarcely 20, with wide, frightened eyes that darted nervously around, as if at any moment her worst fears would leap from the shadows to seize her. "Come, my dear," Holmes said gently, his voice unusually kind. "You're safe here. Tell me everything that happened." The maid swallowed, steadied herself, and spoke with surprising clarity despite her visible fear. "My name is Elizabeth Carter, Mr. Holmes. Lord Aldridge employed me as head maid for scarcely 6 months before this terrible tragedy." Holmes nodded, urging her onward with an encouraging gesture. "Yesterday evening," Elizabeth continued softly, her voice trembling, "Lord Aldridge retired to his library at 8 precisely, as was his custom. He specifically instructed me that he was not to be disturbed. By 10 o'clock, when I passed by the library door, I noticed it was still firmly shut. The gaslight was visible through the keyhole, suggesting he remained awake. I returned again, shortly after midnight, concerned by the lateness of the hour. When I knocked and received no response, I attempted the door. It was locked securely from the inside." She paused, eyes brimming with tears. "I was frightened, Mr. Holmes, and summoned Mr. Pritchard, our butler. Together, we broke open the door and found his lordship slumped over his desk, stabbed through the heart. Yet the windows were locked from the inside, and the room had no other exit. Scotland Yard believes I must have had a key or some secret way inside. But I swear to you, sir, I never entered that room after Lord Aldridge retired." Holmes studied her carefully, his eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "And what exactly was Lord Aldridge working on last evening, Elizabeth? Did he seem distressed? Worried, perhaps frightened? She shook her head hesitantly. He had grown increasingly withdrawn over recent days, sir, but I attributed it to his political responsibilities. Lord Aldridge was working tirelessly against a controversial bill, making powerful enemies along the way. Holmes nodded thoughtfully, steepling his fingers beneath his chin as he considered her words. Interesting. And the butler, Mr. Pritchard, would... You say he's a reliable man, trustworthy? Elizabeth appeared startled by the question, but nodded earnestly. He's been with the family over 15 years, Mr. Holmes. I've never known him to be anything but loyal. Indeed, Holmes mused quietly, then glanced toward me with a decisive air. Watson, fetch my coat. Elizabeth, you have done well to come to me directly. It may yet save you from the gallows. The young woman's eyes widened in alarm. Then, you'll take my case, Mr. Holmes. He smiled faintly, a gleam of eager excitement brightening his usually aloof expression. My dear Miss Carter, the instant Scotland Yard pronounced it impossible, I considered the case mine by right. As Holmes pulled on his Inverness cape, his face alight with anticipation of the intellectual challenge awaiting him, I could not help but feel a thrill of my own. Once more, I stood beside my friend on the threshold of the unknown, about to unravel the impossible. Thus began our extraordinary investigation into the mysterious death of Lord Aldridge, a seemingly perfect murder within the confines of a locked room, which only Sherlock Holmes could hope to decipher. With Elizabeth Carter safely dispatched back to her lodgings under Mrs. Hudson's watchful care, Holmes and I set forth toward Belgrave Square, stepping out into the lingering November drizzle. The journey by hansom cab was short but thick with silence, punctuated only by Holmes's occasional restless taps against the carriage window. It was the familiar quiet that heralded an imminent burst of deductive brilliance, and I awaited his insights with mounting curiosity. Belgrave Square appeared mournfully stately as we arrived, its elegant facades masked in a stubborn curtain of mist. Number 16, the Aldridge residence, was grand yet sombre, its windows shuttered and veiled by dark drapes. 2 policemen stood guard at the entrance, their faces stern beneath helmets glistening from the drizzle. One immediately recognized us and stepped aside with a respectful nod. Inspector Lestrade is waiting for you inside, Mr. Holmes. We entered the house, our steps echoing dully across the polished marble hall. Inspector Lestrade stood impatiently near the library door, his usually confident face marked with visible annoyance. He greeted Holmes grudgingly. Thought you might show up eventually. Trust you'll not interfere too much, eh? My dear Lestrade, Holmes replied amiably, though, with an edge of irony, I would never dream of interfering, merely observing. Lestrade harumphed skeptically, then gestured toward the room. It's all exactly as we found it, Holmes. See if you can make anything of it. I tell you, we've already arrested the culprit. Then perhaps you'll indulge me nonetheless, Holmes said quietly, stepping purposefully into the dimly lit library. My first glance at the room sent a chill of unease through me. The body had been removed, yet its violent legacy lingered distinctly in the room's oppressive air. A plush oriental rug still bore faint outlines of chalk marks beside the heavy oak desk, indicating precisely where Lord Aldridge had fallen. The gaslights were burning low, their shadows elongating grotesquely across walls lined with leather-bound volumes and framed portraits of forbidding ancestors. Holmes stood silently for several moments, his piercing eyes taking in every inch of the chamber, absorbing details invisible to ordinary eyes. He moved slowly around the perimeter, examining bookshelves, chairs, and the mantel above the fireplace. Occasionally he paused to kneel, peering carefully at seemingly insignificant objects. Lestrade and I exchanged glances, equally baffled by Holmes's thorough scrutiny of trivialities. At length, Holmes came to rest by the heavy mahogany door, carefully studying the lock and frame. "Inspector," he asked without turning, "how did your men establish the room was locked securely from within?" Lestrade seemed slightly irritated at the question. The key was still in the lock, turned fully from the inside. Windows fastened tight, bolts secured. No one could have entered or exited without unlocking from within. And yet, Holmes murmured thoughtfully, someone must have. He turned his penetrating gaze toward me. "Watson, come here a moment, would you?" I hurried forward, obedient and curious. Holmes gently guided my attention toward the lock mechanism, a finely wrought brass fitting firmly embedded into the door's heavy frame. "Tell me, Watson, what strikes you as unusual about this lock?" I squinted carefully, desperately hoping to discern what Holmes already saw so clearly. "Well, it appears to be entirely standard, Holmes. Solid, perfectly functional, surely quite secure." Holmes smiled briefly, eyes twinkling with mild amusement. "Precisely the point, Watson. It appears completely ordinary, which is itself quite remarkable given the circumstances." Lestrade frowned impatiently. "Come now, Holmes, out with it. What exactly are you insinuating?" Holmes straightened, addressing us both calmly yet deliberately. "Inspector, you have constructed your entire theory around a locked room, a scenario predicated on the assumption that this door could not possibly have been breached without direct access from within. And yet consider, how difficult would it truly be for someone with sufficient ingenuity to stage precisely such an illusion?" Lestrade stared blankly. "Are you suggesting someone staged the entire scene to implicate the maid?" Holmes's voice became colder, more certain. "I suggest precisely that. Consider the maid, young Elizabeth Carter, frightened, naive, and employed scarcely 6 months, hardly someone likely to orchestrate a scheme of such intricate cunning. No, Inspector, this murder bears the marks of meticulous planning by someone thoroughly familiar with the household." Lestrade looked momentarily uncertain, though stubbornness returned swiftly to his expression. "But if not the maid, who then?" "The butler, Mr. Pritchard. We spoke with him extensively. He was assisting the maid in breaking down the door, and servants confirm he had no quarrel with his employer." "Quarrels are not always visible, Inspector," Holmes answered softly, eyes glittering with suppressed excitement. "Nor is innocence guaranteed by mere tenure or reputation. But let us not jump too quickly to conclusions." Holmes turned abruptly toward the expansive desk. Papers lay scattered across its surface, many appearing recently shuffled through or examined hurriedly. Carefully he lifted a few sheets, eyes rapidly scanning their contents. After several minutes of focused scrutiny, he stopped short, abruptly gripping a particular document. For a moment his body stiffened subtly, barely perceptible but unmistakably significant to my practiced eye. "What is it, Holmes?" I asked eagerly, stepping forward. Holmes's reply was cryptic. "It appears Lord Aldridge was indeed involved in a dangerous game of politics, one far more perilous than young Elizabeth Carter realized." Lestrade's voice grew cautious. "Political enemies, you suspect? But how does that explain a locked room? Murder?" Holmes pocketed the document, clearly unwilling to divulge more at present. "A locked room murder," he replied coolly, "is not a mystery of impossibility, but rather a puzzle of limited possibilities. Whoever executed this crime relied heavily upon the assumption that the apparent impossibility itself would serve as their greatest protection. So you have a theory, Holmes?" Lestrade pressed, clearly frustrated by Holmes's refusal to share more openly. Holmes nodded thoughtfully, eyes distant as though already visualizing the sequence of events. "A provisional hypothesis, Inspector, but I require more data. Much more. Watson, we must speak immediately with Mr. Pritchard. There are certain elements only he can clarify." "Do you suspect the butler after all, Holmes?" I asked quietly as we moved from the oppressive library back toward the grand hallway. "Suspect?" Holmes echoed quietly. "My dear Watson, suspicion is premature, but Mr. Pritchard undoubtedly holds critical pieces of information that may illuminate the entire puzzle. And despite Inspector Lestrade's assertions, there is a powerful force of motive lurking beneath this household's genteel facade." Outside, the rain intensified into heavier droplets, drumming against pavement stones, masking our hurried footsteps as we approached the servants' quarters situated discreetly toward the rear gardens. Mr. Pritchard answered our brisk knock. Almost immediately, his thin, lined face shadowed with anxiety. "I wondered when you'd come to see me," he said softly, his voice strained with suppressed fear. "This house, Mr. Holmes, it has become a very dangerous place." Holmes's eyes narrowed perceptibly at this admission. "Then you are ready to speak freely, Mr. Pritchard?" The old butler glanced around nervously before opening the door wider. Please, come in quickly. I fear I've already said too much. As we crossed the threshold into the dimly lit servants' quarters, a palpable tension closed around us, thickening the air. I felt distinctly that we stood upon the edge of a darker revelation yet to unfold, a revelation that might swiftly turn Holmes's hypothesis into dangerous reality. The butler's quarters were modest, a plain room with a threadbare carpet, 2 stiff-backed chairs, and a modest desk stacked with correspondence in tidy rows. A single oil lamp cast an amber glow across the space, leaving the corners in shadow. Mr. Pritchard motioned for us to sit, then turned the key in the door before settling opposite us. His hands, though steady, bore the slight tremor of a man, weighed by secrets. Holmes leaned forward, his voice measured but piercing. "You said this house has become dangerous. Speak plainly, Mr. Pritchard. We are past the point of discretion." The butler looked down at his gloved hands for a moment before lifting his gaze to Holmes's. "I fear for Miss Carter," he said, "and now for myself. I've served this house for 15 years and I know its rhythms better than most. Lord Aldridge had enemies, yes, but not just in Parliament. There was something else, something closer to home." "Go on," Holmes prompted softly. Mr. Pritchard drew a slow breath. "Over the last fortnight I noticed changes in his lordship's manner. He took to locking himself away for hours, sometimes entire nights, in the library. When I brought him his evening brandy, he would barely acknowledge me. Once or twice I found burnt scraps in the fireplace. And," he hesitated, eyes flicking toward the door, then lowering his voice to a whisper, "twice I saw a man leave through the back garden gate, a stranger, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark overcoat and hat pulled low. I asked no questions. My place is not to pry, but both times his lordship was visibly shaken afterward." "When was the last time you saw this man?" Holmes asked, his eyes narrowing. "The night before the murder." Holmes sat back, fingers steepled in thought. "Describe him again." Mr. Pritchard nodded. "Broad in the chest, clean-shaven, pale, moved like a man used to silence. I cannot say more than that, I'm afraid." Holmes stood, restless now. He paced once across the room, then stopped. "And yet none of this made it into your statement to the police." The butler flushed slightly. I did not think it connected. Scotland Yard seemed certain of the maid's guilt. They asked few questions." "They always do when the solution appears too neat," Holmes murmured. "Tell me, what of the maid's access to the library? Did she have a key?" "No," Pritchard said firmly. "Only Lord Aldridge had the master key. He would lock the library each night himself. And yet the key was found in the lock from the inside," I added, recalling Lestrade's earlier statement. "Indeed," Holmes said. "Which begs a question. Where is the master key now?" Mr. Pritchard hesitated. "After the door was forced and the body found, the police took the key as evidence. I believe it is still with them." Holmes gave a short nod. "That may prove crucial later. Now tell me, did Lord Aldridge keep a safe or strongbox in the library?" Mr. Pritchard's eyes flickered. "Yes, behind the books on the eastern wall. Few knew of it, but I did. He often kept sensitive correspondence locked away, and was it opened after the murder? I cannot say." Holmes turned abruptly, the energy of his mind reignited. "Watson, we must return to the library immediately. I've overlooked something." We rose, and Mr. Pritchard followed us to the door, his brow lined with worry. "Do be careful, Mr. Holmes. There's something unnatural about this affair. I can feel it in my bones." "I quite agree," Holmes replied without irony, then led us swiftly back through the corridor and into the now dimmed grandeur of the Aldridge Library. Holmes moved with quiet precision toward the eastern wall, running his fingers lightly over the spines of ancient volumes. I stood beside him as he found a false panel behind the third shelf, cleverly hinged, barely perceptible. Behind it sat a small iron safe, its surface dusty and its keyhole untouched. "Unopened," Holmes said softly. "The killer either didn't know of it or chose not to disturb it." "Then whatever they sought wasn't here?" I asked. "Or," Holmes replied, "they found what they were looking for elsewhere." He turned to the desk once more and resumed his earlier inspection. I watched as he opened each drawer with deliberate care, noting every object, every letter and envelope. Then suddenly he paused, "Watson," he said, holding up a torn envelope, "look at this. It bore a foreign postmark, Madrid. The handwriting was elegant, feminine. The contents were missing, but the remaining stub of the letter suggested it had been hastily torn away. A faint perfume still clung to the parchment. "A woman," I said, stating the obvious. Holmes gave a faint smile. "Always, Watson, you have a gift for romance. Yes, a woman, but not merely a romantic interlude. Look at the date, just 3 days before the murder, and the return name, CM, no full signature." He sniffed the envelope. "Jasmine and tobacco, an uncommon mixture." She was bold, perhaps dangerous. "What of the missing letter?" I asked. "Burned, no doubt," Holmes said. "Perhaps among those ashes Pritchard mentioned. We'll need them sifted. But this gives us motive. A potential blackmail, perhaps. Or scandal. Something worth killing to conceal." We were interrupted by the sound of rapid footsteps in the corridor. A constable entered, out of breath. "Inspector Lestrade asks you to come at once, Mr. Holmes. Something's happened." Without waiting for further explanation, we followed him back into the main hall where Lestrade stood stiffly, his usual bluster replaced by pale tension. "What is it?" Holmes asked at once. Lestrade gestured toward the foyer. "The young Maid, Elizabeth Carter. She's gone, escaped her lodgings an hour ago." Holmes's face darkened, though not with surprise. "You had her under guard?" "Of course," Lestrade snapped. "One of my men was stationed outside, but he claims she slipped out through the garden behind the boarding house, gone without a trace." "She's frightened," Holmes murmured, "and someone made her more frightened still, enough to flee or worse." "You think she's been abducted?" I asked. Holmes didn't answer at first. He turned, staring out through the rain-blurred window as though trying to draw truth from the fog. "Inspector," he said slowly, "we must find her before anyone else does. This is no longer a matter of simple guilt or innocence. Miss Carter's life is now at risk." Lestrade gave the faintest nod, his expression grim. "We'll check all ports and stations. I've already sent out an alert." Holmes paced for a moment, then stopped. "There is another angle. I want the name of every person who knew Lord Aldridge was to be alone in the library that night. Every servant, every visitor, every member of his household staff. I want records, letters, receipts, and above all, I want to know who stands to gain from his death." "And where will you be?" Lestrade asked. Holmes's expression shifted, a spark of purpose returning to his eyes. "I shall pay a visit to Lord Aldridge's solicitor. The contents of his last will and testament may shine light where the gas lamps fail." With that, Holmes turned sharply, coat swirling behind him, and vanished into the rainy grey outside. I followed, heart thudding. The fog had thickened, and so too had the mystery, winding tighter around us like a noose. Somewhere out there, a frightened maid was either running from justice or toward a danger more terrible still. And behind it all, someone watched from the shadows, counting on the illusion of a locked room to bury the truth. Holmes would not let them succeed. The rain had settled into a steady rhythm by the time we reached the office of Aldridge and Braithwaite, solicitors, a somber brick building nestled along Lincoln's Inn Fields. Holmes, still wearing the wet sheen of his exertion, moved with grim urgency as he mounted the stone steps and rapped crisply at the door. We were admitted promptly by a thin, nervous clerk who led us to a modest chamber lined with ledgers and smelling faintly of damp vellum. Mr. Hugh Braithwaite, Lord Aldridge's solicitor for over 2 decades, was a man of precise manner and wary eyes. He rose at our entrance, his fingers momentarily pausing over a heavy parchment ledger on his desk. He did not offer his hand. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, voice clipped. "I expected you might come. I trust this is not merely another intrusion at Scotland Yard's behest." Holmes offered a tight smile. "Inspector Lestrade is occupied with less delicate matters. I've come in the service of truth." Braithwaite motioned stiffly to the chairs before his desk, though he remained standing. "I imagine you want to discuss Lord Aldridge's will." "Indeed," Holmes replied. "Was there anything unusual about its terms?" The solicitor frowned, adjusting his spectacles. "Unusual? In what way?" Holmes's gaze sharpened. "In any way, Mr. Braithwaite. Changes made recently, irregular bequests, sudden exclusions. I will not waste time on pleasantries." Braithwaite hesitated, then opened a thin black portfolio. The will was revised precisely 11 days before Lord Aldridge's death. That is notable if you're looking for recent alterations. The new draft replaced an older will from 1894. Holmes raised an eyebrow. And the nature of these revisions? Braithwaite ran his finger along the list. He disinherited his nephew, Mr. Cecil Aldridge, previously the primary heir. Instead, a significant portion of the estate was redirected toward a private educational trust and, most unexpectedly, to a woman named Clara Morgan. I exchanged a glance with Holmes, feeling a flicker of recognition. "CM," Holmes said softly. Braithwaite looked up sharply. "You've heard of her?" "Only the initials," Holmes replied. "From a letter received 3 days prior to the murder, Madrid postmark. Is Miss Morgan known to you?" Braithwaite's mouth drew tight. "Only by name. I was instructed to include her in the will. A legacy of $25,000 to be delivered upon confirmation of Lord Aldridge's death. No contact address provided, only a bank routing for a private Spanish account. Highly irregular but not illegal," he insisted. Holmes stood. "That sum would provide considerable incentive." "Indeed," Braithwaite admitted. "Though, without proof of her involvement, one can only speculate." Holmes turned to the clerk's desk and ran a finger absently along its edge. "Has she been contacted?" "We've attempted to send notice to the bank listed in the will," Braithwaite said. "No reply yet." Holmes nodded, but his gaze was distant. "Thank you, Mr. Braithwaite. You've been most helpful." As we stepped back into the rain-slick street, I couldn't contain my curiosity. "Clara Morgan, do you suppose she's our mysterious visitor, the one Pritchard saw in the garden?" "Unlikely," Holmes replied. "Pritchard's description points to a man. However, Miss Morgan's inclusion in the will changes the dynamic considerably. A blackmail victim does not often reward her tormentor, unless she herself holds leverage. I believe Lord Aldridge feared exposure, and Miss Morgan held the key. The payout was a form of protection. Then why would he be murdered?" I asked. "Surely payment would satisfy her." "Not if someone else believed her presence threatened their interests," Holmes said. "Imagine, Aldridge changes his will, disinherits his heir, names a mysterious woman as beneficiary. That alone could spark fury in someone who once stood to inherit everything. Someone who knew Miss Morgan had only to appear for their fortune to vanish." "Cecil Aldridge," I muttered. Holmes gave a small nod. "It is time we paid a visit to the nephew." We located Mr. Cecil Aldridge at his club in St. James's, a fashionable haunt favoured by younger gentlemen of means and moderate intellect. He was seated in a leather armchair, sipping port beneath a portrait of the late Prime Minister, looking entirely too at ease for a man recently disinherited. He stood upon seeing us, eyebrows rising with vague curiosity. "Mr. Holmes, is it? My condolences that it took you so long to arrive." Holmes inclined his head. "You've heard about your uncle's death, I presume?" Cecil shrugged. "Hard to avoid. Half the club is gossiping. Locked room mystery and all that. You seem unshaken." Another shrug. "We were never close. He hadn't spoken to me in months. I suppose he finally followed through on his threats." Holmes's voice was casual. "What threats?" "Oh, he was always grumbling about something. My debts, my indolence, that's what he called it. He said he'd cut me out entirely if I didn't clean up my affairs. I assumed it was more bark than bite. But he did cut you out." Flicker of annoyance crossed Cecil's face. "So I hear. Braithwaite wouldn't give me details, but I know when a solicitor stops returning your calls." Holmes studied him. "You bear him no ill will, then?" Cecil's smile was thin. "My uncle was a proud man, proud and vindictive. He got the last word, fine. But I'll land on my feet. I've friends, investments. Do any of these friends know Miss Clara Morgan?" That wiped the smile from his face. "Who?" Holmes was already watching closely. "A woman to whom your uncle left a rather generous sum." Cecil blinked. "Never heard of her." Holmes paused. "Did you happen to visit your uncle the evening of his death?" Cecil's voice grew defensive. "Certainly not. I was at the club the whole evening. You can ask the steward." Holmes's tone was gentle but piercing. "And yet a man matching your build was seen leaving Lord Aldridge's back garden that very night." Cecil's eyes narrowed. "Is that an accusation?" No, Holmes replied. It is an observation, one I'll allow you to consider carefully. We left the club in silence, the fog thickening once more around us. I turned to Holmes. You think it's him? No. Holmes said quietly. He's vain and bitter, but not clever enough. That kind of man poisons, shoots, or hires someone with dirty fingernails. A locked room illusion requires invention. Then who? That, Holmes murmured, is precisely what we must now determine. But first, we must find Clara Morgan. We returned to Baker Street that evening. Holmes disappeared into his bedroom and emerged half an hour later in disguise, his hair darkened, moustache trimmed, a patch worn over one eye, clothes rumpled like a man used to cheap rooms and cheaper. "Jin, where are you going?" I asked. "To a small Spanish cafe near Whitechapel," he said. "There's a clerk at the Spanish consulate with loose lips and a fondness for card games. If Clara Morgan has been in London recently, he'll know." "You're going alone?" "Safer. That way," Holmes said. "You, meanwhile, must stay here in case Miss Carter returns or someone tries to silence her." I watched him vanish into the London fog once more, swallowed by the same night that had hidden Lord Aldridge's killer. Alone in the sitting room, I stared at the fire, unease prickling at my spine. Somewhere beyond the wet stones of Baker Street, a woman held the thread of a mystery that was tightening with every passing hour, and Holmes, ever the master of threads, was walking straight into its heart. The hours passed slowly in Holmes's absence, the gas lamps beyond the window casting pale shadows that trembled across the sitting-room walls. I stirred the fire more out of restlessness than necessity, unable to settle. My thoughts circled around Clara Morgan, the torn letter from Madrid, the unexplained figure seen leaving through the garden, and the terrifying possibility that Elizabeth Carter, still missing, might be in mortal danger. I was deep in such thoughts when the sharp rap of the front door jolted me upright. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps hurried along the hallway, followed by a muffled exchange I couldn't make out. A moment later, she appeared at the door of our rooms. Her expression drawn tight. "She's here," she whispered. "The maid, she's come back." I leapt to my feet as Elizabeth Carter stepped into the room, her face pale, soaked with rain, her cloak clutched around her like a shield. Her eyes darted around the sitting room until they found me, and some of the tension in her posture eased. I didn't know where else to go," she stammered. "Miss Carter," I said gently, guiding her to the hearth. "You did right. You're safe here. Sit down. Let me take your cloak." She shivered as she sank into the armchair. Her hands, thin and trembling, clutched the fabric of her skirt. I could see the streaks of fear that rain could not wash away. "I wasn't running," she said quickly. "I swear it. I was followed. Someone was watching me. I felt it all day. And then this evening, I heard footsteps behind me on Cavendish Street. I turned, but the man ducked out of sight. That's when I ran." "Did you see his face?" I asked. "No, just the outline. He was tall, heavy coat. He followed me halfway across Bloomsbury. I slipped into a laundry yard and hid there for over an hour. I only came here when I was sure I'd lost him." I nodded, but my thoughts churned. This wasn't the action of a guilty woman. This was someone being hunted. Before I could ask further, the door creaked again and Holmes swept into the room like a gust of wind. He paused mid-stride at the sight of Elizabeth, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to me and spoke crisply. "Watson, have you your notes from earlier today?" "Yes, of course. It's good. We'll need them." "Miss Carter, your arrival is most timely. I believe your life is in considerable danger, and you were right to trust your instincts, but I need your help if we are to unravel the rest of this." Elizabeth nodded, her fear warred now with the faintest trace of hope. Holmes tossed aside his damp cloak and settled beside the fire, steam rising faintly from his shoulders. "I have returned from Whitechapel with more than gin on my breath. The clerk I sought was remarkably forthcoming, especially after I helped him reclaim his wagered pocket watch from a rigged game." He leaned forward. "Clara Morgan exists, and she has been in London for nearly 2 weeks." Elizabeth blinked. "Who is she?" "That is the question," Holmes said. "According to my source, Miss Morgan arrived from Madrid under a French passport and stayed at a modest boarding house near Soho. She gave no occupation, paid in cash and left suddenly 2 nights ago." "The night before the murder," I said quietly. "Precisely," Holmes replied. She told the landlady she had come to collect a debt, but I doubt that was all she intended. Elizabeth's hands tightened around the arms of the chair. But what does she want from me? I believe, Holmes said softly, she wants you out of the way. You were the last person to see Lord Aldridge alive, and perhaps you saw or heard more than you realize. Elizabeth shook her head. I knocked once, just lightly. No response. I left straight away. And yet, Holmes said, someone was already in that room. He stood, pacing. We must re-examine everything. Let us suppose Clara Morgan came not as a blackmailer, but as something more intimate, an estranged mistress, perhaps even the mother of a child Lord Aldridge refused to acknowledge. The will was amended, a legacy granted, perhaps out of guilt. But if Clara feared he might change his mind again, or if someone else feared she might be exposed, then murder becomes a rational solution. You think she killed him? I asked. Holmes tilted his head. Possibly, or perhaps she came only to witness the man who betrayed her one last time, and someone else seized the moment. He turned to Elizabeth again. Tell me carefully, were there any unusual sounds that night, anything at all, even something that seemed insignificant? She closed her eyes. Only a click, like a hinge or a latch. Very faint. But I remember it now. It came just after. I knocked, and then silence again. Holmes's eyes flashed. Yes, that would do. The library, Watson, remember? Window bolts fastened, the lock turned from the inside. But if someone were already hidden inside, waiting perhaps behind the curtain or in the wall recess, then the illusion is complete. The locked room is not locked to the killer. It's locked only to the world. And the killer exits afterward. Exactly. Through disguise or timing or an accomplice, I felt a chill. And what now? Holmes crossed to the desk and began scribbling a note. We find Clara Morgan, before she disappears again, or before someone silences her. I've written to the Spanish consulate under her assumed name. She may be foolish enough to retrieve it, and Watson, yes? We post a watch on the Aldridge property. There's something left unfinished there, something our killer fears we may yet discover. He sealed the note and handed it to me. Have it sent immediately, and then fetch Wiggins and the boys. I want eyes in Soho, Bloomsbury, and around the docks. No one leaves this city unnoticed. That night, I barely slept. Holmes remained seated by the fire until dawn, fingers steepled, eyes fixed on the far, distance as if reading the air for secrets. Elizabeth slept fitfully on the settee, wrapped in a blanket, her breath shallow with tension. By sunrise, the fog had lifted slightly. A knock came at the door just as the first light turned the rooftops gold. Wiggins stood there, hat in hand, cheeks red from the wind. She's been seen, he said. Clara Morgan. A man down by St. Catherine docks says she boarded a private vessel last night. Said she was heading for Spain. Ship's called the Santa Estrella. She's still moored. Holmes was already on his feet. Then we still have time. As we stepped into the morning light, I caught a glimpse of Elizabeth, at the window, eyes wide with fear and something more resolve. She understood now what we faced, and ahead of us the mist parted just enough to glimpse the final turn of the web. The Santa Estrella waited at the docks, and with it, the truth. The cab wheels sliced through the morning mist with the crisp urgency of a clock nearing the hour. Holmes sat opposite me, fingers pressed beneath his chin, gaze distant. He hadn't spoken since we'd left Baker Street, but I could feel the tension humming off him like a charged wire. It was not the nervousness of uncertainty, but the electric, calm before resolution, a hunter closing in on the final trace of prey. The Santa Estrella was still moored at St. Catherine docks when we arrived, a sleek vessel of modest size but foreign make, its name painted in flaking gold across a pale blue hull. A single sailor smoked lazily by the gangplank, but otherwise the ship appeared quiet. Holmes approached with the air of a man accustomed to command. "I need to speak with your passenger," he said, his tone cutting clean through the dockside hush. "A woman, Clara Morgan. She boarded last night." The sailor eyed him warily. "Captain's orders. No visitors till clearance. We are bound for Santander this evening." Holmes slipped a hand into his coat and produced a folded document. You will find this is an urgent matter involving Scotland Yard. Either you take me to her, or the entire vessel will be held for inspection. The man's eyes narrowed at the name scrawled at the bottom, Lestrade's signature, forged with frightening accuracy, and after a moment's hesitation he gestured toward the lower deck. She's in the second cabin, portside. We followed him silently down a narrow passageway that reeked of salt, oil, and old wood. He knocked once, then stepped aside. A pause, then a voice, low but composed. "Who is it?" "Mr. Holmes," came the reply from my companion, calm but firm. The door opened slowly. Clara Morgan stood in the doorway. She was perhaps 30, with dark auburn hair pinned tightly at the nape, and a figure wrapped in a travelling cloak that had once been elegant, but was now worn at the seams. Her expression was cool, her eyes, intelligent, unreadable, lingered for a long moment on Holmes. "I wondered if you would find me," she said softly. Holmes stepped past her without invitation. I followed, closing the door behind us. "Miss Morgan," he began, removing his hat, "you've been at the edge of this affair from the start. Now you must tell us precisely how close." She remained standing, arms folded. "Why should I? You think I killed him?" "No," Holmes said. "I think you cared for him. And that perhaps frightened someone far more than hatred would." She let out a soft, mirthless laugh. "He wrote me once, 2 years ago. Said he was sorry. Said he wished he'd chosen differently. That's when I knew he was dying, not from illness but guilt." "You came to London for money?" I asked. She turned to me. "I came because I didn't want him to die thinking I hated him. Because we had a child once. He made me give him up, claimed it would ruin his standing. And because when he wrote again last month he said he'd changed his will." "You never asked for the money?" Holmes asked. "No, he offered it. I asked for only one thing, to meet him in private, and he agreed. But when I arrived that night and the lights were off," she paused, blinking rapidly, "I waited near the garden gate, just where he told me to, and then I saw movement at the window. Not him. Someone else, a man, large, broad-shouldered. He turned once as the curtains shifted, and I recognized him from a portrait, his nephew." "Cecil Aldridge," I murmured. "I left," she said. "I didn't want a scene, but I knew something was wrong. That man looked angry, controlled. I went back to my room and packed. I was afraid. If Cecil knew I was in London, he would guess why, and what it meant for him." Holmes was quiet, his mind turning. "And you saw no one else that night?" "No. You didn't enter the house? I swear I never touched the door. I never even stepped off the garden path." Holmes nodded slowly. "And do you know if Lord Aldridge ever kept records? Journals, perhaps? Letters relating to the child?" She looked up, startled. "He said he had written me a final letter. He promised he would leave it with his solicitor, or in his safe. I was to receive it only after his death. But I never did." "That may explain what the killer was looking for," Holmes murmured. She stepped closer to him. "Mr. Holmes, I have nothing left to hide. I told Lord Aldridge I had forgiven him. He wept the last time we spoke, said he had told too many lies to fix them all, but he promised the truth would outlive him." Holmes's expression was unreadable. "It may yet." He turned to go, and she stopped him. "Will they arrest?" "Me? Not if I can help it," he said. "But be ready, Miss Morgan. The killer may believe you know more than you do. That makes you dangerous." We left the ship without delay, Holmes silent all the way back to the carriage. Only once we were seated again did he speak. "She told the truth," he said. There was no tremor in her voice when she saw the nephew, no flinching at the name. "She didn't kill Aldridge." "Then it was Cecil," I said. "Possibly," Holmes replied. "But I no longer think he acted alone. This was too clean, too carefully staged. The torn letter, the missing will entry, the safe untouched. Someone tried to seal Lord Aldridge." In silence. "And someone else has been watching every move since." We had scarcely returned to Baker Street when a knock came at the door again. This time it was Lestrade. "I came straight from the docks," he said. "You were right about the ship. But I've more news." He held up a small parcel wrapped in oilcloth. "This was found buried in the coal bin behind the Aldridge estate. Burned edges, letters, mostly ash, but one remained partially intact. Holmes took it carefully, laying it on the desk. The handwriting was Aldridge's. What was left read, "Should anything happen to me, know that Clara Morgan was never a threat. The true danger lies closer to home. I have written the name in the ledger." The page ended in a jagged scorch. Holmes stood at once. "Watson, come." "The library ledger. We never checked the most obvious place of all." We made haste once more to Belgrave Square. The butler, Mr. Pritchard, admitted us without question, eyes wide as he stepped aside. Holmes went straight to the ledger cabinet beside the hearth, pulled the accounts volume for the week prior to the murder, and flipped to the back cover. There, faintly stitched into the inner lining, was a folded sheet. Holmes removed it carefully. A single name, Arthur Pritchard. I stared in stunned silence. The butler, the loyal servant. Holmes's eyes remained hard. He forged the library key. He knew the study better than anyone. He let Cecil in through the garden door, and perhaps more. But he remained hidden, waiting. Then, once Lord Aldridge dismissed Cecil, Pritchard emerged and killed him himself. At that moment, a noise behind us, a sudden intake of breath. We turned. Mr. Pritchard stood in the doorway, pale as stone. "I had no choice," he said softly. Holmes's voice was cold. "You had 1,000 choices. You chose murder." "I gave him 20 years, the butler said, stepping backward. "He was going to give it all to a woman who'd left him, to a cause he barely knew. I deserved more." Lestrade stepped forward, cuffs already in hand, and as he led the butler away in stunned silence, Holmes turned to me, gaze distant. "In the end, it was not the locked door that fooled us," he said. "It was the open face. The man who stood, too close, too long to ever be suspected." The case was closed, but long after the fire had gone out that evening, Holmes remained at the window, unmoving. I did not disturb him. He was thinking, as he often did in such moments, of how easily truth can be hidden in plain sight. The hour was approaching midnight when Lestrade's cab departed from Belgrave Square, Pritchard seated in silence beside him, his face no longer composed but slack with the first signs of collapse. Holmes watched from the steps of the Aldridge residence, his coat collar turned high against the evening chill, his gaze fixed not on the departing carriage, but on some unseen point in the gloom, as though still probing the cracks of a mystery that had ostensibly been solved. I stepped down to join him, my boots echoing against the cold flagstones. "It was the butler all along," I said quietly. "And yet you suspected him only after Clara confirmed Cecil's presence." Holmes nodded, but his expression remained distant. "No, Watson. I suspected Pritchard long before, but suspicion is one thing, certainty another. Until tonight, we lacked the evidence to separate illusion from intent." He turned and stepped back into the house, beckoning me with a motion of his hand. "Come. There's one final thread left to draw tight." Inside, the grand library was as we had left it, somber, cavernous, still bearing the faint scent of old paper and colder truths. Holmes walked to the hearth and stood in front of the carved mantelpiece, his hands resting lightly upon its edge. I joined him there, waiting for the silence to break. "It was a masterstroke," he said softly. "Pritchard played his part with exquisite subtlety. He allowed the appearance of suspicion to fall upon others while staying well within the bounds of a loyal servant. But his mistake, Watson, was in believing that proximity granted him invisibility." I thought of the ledgers, the hidden letter, the silent way Pritchard moved through the house. "You believe he acted alone in the killing?" "No," Holmes replied, turning toward me. "He had an accomplice, witting or not. Cecil Aldridge provided him the opportunity, but the actual crime, the moment of violence, that was Pritchard's alone." He paused, then added, "And yet, there's still something unresolved." I frowned. The motive was clear, the inheritance, his bitterness. "Yes," Holmes said, "but not the timing." "Why now? Why on that particular evening, with Clara in London and Cecil lurking in the garden?" He crossed the room in 3 long strides and reached for the fireplace. Donks. Carefully he stirred the remains of the hearth, lifting fragments of charred paper that had escaped the constable's initial collection. One small corner of parchment, blackened but intact, bore a single red seal, partially melted but unmistakable. Holmes held it to the light. The family crest. I peered closer. The Aldridge seal. Used for personal correspondence only, Holmes murmured. Which means the letter Clara never received, the one her lover promised her, was likely here, destroyed in the same fire that concealed everything else. He placed the fragment on the mantelpiece, then straightened, the faintest note of melancholy in his voice. Pritchard didn't merely kill for money, he killed for control, for the power to decide what truths would survive. We left the house soon after. I noticed, as we passed into the quiet of the street, that Holmes paused just briefly to glance back at the upper windows of the Aldridge home, his eyes lingering on the darkness behind the glass. The fog had returned by the time we reached Baker Street, clinging low to the cobbles like regret. Mrs. Hudson had left a kettle warm on the hob, and Holmes wordlessly poured us each a cup of tea before retreating once more to his familiar seat near the fire. He sat there for a long while, cup untouched, gaze fixed on the flames. I knew better than to interrupt him in such moments. The case was over, but it had left behind its quiet residue, as all such affairs did, an echo of unfinished sentences and thoughts too jagged to name. At last, he spoke. "Do you recall, Watson, when Elizabeth Carter said she heard a hinge just after she knocked?" I nodded. "Yes, it was what confirmed your theory, that someone was already inside the room." Holmes's mouth turned downward in a line of quiet thought. But what, if there was more to that sound? A hinge, yes, but not a door hinge, a concealed compartment perhaps. Something Pritchard used in haste. I set my cup down. "You think he was hiding something else?" "I think," Holmes said, standing abruptly, "that we must revisit that library one final time before the house is sealed and the estate passed on. There may be something left, something even Pritchard didn't trust the fire to destroy." And so it was, hours before dawn, that we once again stepped into the Aldridge library. A constable on night duty granted us entry without resistance, and Holmes moved swiftly, his lantern casting long shadows as he searched. This time he focused, not on the bookshelves or the desk, but on the wall paneling behind the large portrait of Lord Aldridge's father. It took only moments before he found it. A thin seam in the wainscoting, a sliver of brass nearly invisible beneath the carved moulding. With the tip of his cane, Holmes pressed the latch, and the panel released with a soft click. Behind it, nestled, in a narrow recess, sat a velvet-lined box. Holmes removed it carefully and opened the lid. Inside were two items: a folded letter, sealed and unbroken, and a small photograph, faded but unmistakably clear. Lord Aldridge, younger, seated beside Clara Morgan, an infant between them. Holmes passed me the letter. "Read it aloud." I broke the seal and read by lantern light. "To Clara, if you are reading this, then I am gone. I can never undo what I did, what I forced you to give up. Our child deserved better. I can only leave behind truth and what little legacy is still within my power. I've instructed Braithwaite to honor the amended will, and should anything befall me, the truth will lie in this room. I have left behind too many lies, but you were never one of them. I loved you silently, weakly, but entirely. Forgive me." Our Aldridge, I looked up. Holmes was watching me closely. "He never intended to leave the letter in the safe," Holmes said. "He feared Pritchard already suspected him. He knew his time was short, so he hid it in the one place only someone with knowledge of the house's oldest fittings would find, and that meant Pritchard wouldn't. He meant for Clara to have it all along." "Yes," Holmes said, "and now she shall." By noon that day, the letter and photograph were delivered to Miss Morgan. She received them with silent tears, and after reading the contents, stood for a long time at the window of Holmes's sitting room, her hands trembling around the edges of the page. "I didn't come for money," she said at last. "I came because I needed to believe that once, even briefly, he chose me." "He did," Holmes said simply. She left without fanfare, clutching the box against her chest, and disappeared into the London crowd, a ghost with her peace at last. Holmes said nothing for the rest of the day. But that evening, as we sat once more by the fire, I noticed a faint smile cross his lips. Not smug, not satisfied, but something quieter. "You see, Watson," he said, "for all the deception in that house, it was not logic that solved it. It was love discarded and delayed, but not entirely forgotten. Even the cleverest crime cannot undo what the heart records." I raised my cup in silent agreement. The case of the locked room was closed, yes, but the truth it concealed had not been lost to smoke and silence. Holmes had reached beyond the puzzle into the soul of the matter, and in doing so, he had, perhaps without meaning to, restored something, far rarer than justice. 2 days passed in a hush that followed the unraveling of any great case, like the lingering stillness after a storm. The newspapers printed their versions of events with the usual flourish: locked room killer caught, servant's betrayal shocks Belgravia, disinherited nephew questioned and cleared, and even one speculative piece hinting that Sherlock Holmes had uncovered a scandal reaching into Parliament itself. Holmes ignored them all. He spent the time in familiar habits. His violin murmured mournfully in the late hours, chemical scents drifted from the table beside the window, and his pipe left lazy spirals of smoke hanging in the air. I returned to my notes, refining the narrative, though something about it still felt unfinished. Holmes's expression confirmed my unease. The crime was solved, the letters delivered, and yet a faint residue of disquiet clung to the edges of the affair. It was just past noon on the third day when Inspector Lestrade arrived, looking unusually unsettled. He entered without ceremony, brushing a light dusting of soot from his sleeve and nodding curtly to Mrs. Hudson as he passed. "Holmes," he said, standing stiffly by the hearth, "we've just finished going through Pritchard's quarters at the Aldrich house. Routine, you understand. Gathering final evidence, sealing documents. We found something." Holmes looked up from his armchair. "Something you believe contradicts the confession?" "Not contradicts," Lestrade said slowly, "but complicates. You'd better see it." He withdrew a folded sheet of parchment from his coat and passed it over. Holmes unfolded it without a word. I rose and leaned in to read. It was written in an elegant, slanted hand, not Pritchard's, but the name signed at the bottom left me chilled: Cecil Aldridge. Holmes read aloud, his voice steady: "To whom it may. Concern if anything happens to me. Understand that I acted only under pressure. I never touched my uncle. I was there that night, yes, but I left while he was still alive. I swear it. I came only to confront him over the will. Pritchard. He said the legacy was a betrayal. He said we could fix it together. But I never agreed to murder. I never meant for it to go that far." There was a long silence. "He left it in Pritchard's wardrobe," Lestrade said grimly, "in a sealed envelope marked 'Only if I vanish.' We nearly missed it, tucked in the lining of a coat. Self-preservation," Holmes murmured. "He feared the storm but didn't expect the thunder to fall so close. What do you intend to do?" "Nothing," Lestrade said with a faint grimace. "There's no crime in being a coward, not by the letter. And Pritchard made no mention of a co-conspirator, but I thought you ought to see it." Holmes nodded. "You were right to bring it." After Lestrade left, Holmes sat for a long while, staring at the letter in silence. At last he said, "The boy was weak, easily manipulated, but he didn't strike the fatal blow." I sat across from him, and yet he stood at the threshold of it, let Pritchard in, argued, perhaps raged, but still left Aldridge alive. It's hard to know whether that absolves him or damns him. Holmes raised his eyes to mine. "That is for time to decide. Perhaps this letter was his first honest act. Perhaps not." He set the letter aside and picked up his violin. The first note hung in the air, and for a while we both let it settle, over the unfinished weight of what remained. That evening, as the gas lamps flickered into life along Baker Street, we received another visitor. This time, it was not the police, nor any of the figures caught in the case's orbit, but a courier, in plain dress, who handed Holmes a stiff envelope bearing the seal of Aldridge and Braithwaite. Holmes opened it carefully. Inside was a folded sheet, a brief letter from Mr. Braithwaite himself, and another document older, creased from years of storage. Holmes read silently for some time, then passed the older document to me. It was Lord Aldridge's will, not the revised one, but the original from 1894. I scanned the contents. Cecil Aldridge had been named as sole heir to the estate, as expected. No mention of any charity, no educational trust, and certainly no Clara Morgan. "Braithwaite sent this without prompting?" I asked. "He did," Holmes replied. "It seems he found it while reorganizing the firm's archive. He includes in his note that the will had been withdrawn, but never officially destroyed." I frowned. "So there were two wills in play." "Two documents," Holmes said, "but only one intention. The newer will, the one leaving assets to Clara Morgan and the Educational Trust, was properly witnessed and legally binding. The older one is nothing more than a ghost. But someone, Pritchard, I suspect, knew of its contents and held them as proof of what Cecil once stood to inherit. And that knowledge," I said slowly, "was enough to drive him to desperation. Not to kill," Holmes corrected gently, "but to allow it to happen. And now he must live with the knowledge that his silence bore fruit." We sat in silence again, the fire crackling low between us. I watched Holmes as he stared once more into the dancing flames. "You still feel something is unresolved?" I said. He nodded. "Clara Morgan received her truth. The letter, the photograph, the recognition. But I wonder if even that can mend what was broken." I stood and poured 2 cups of tea, setting one beside him. "Some mysteries, Holmes, don't require solving, only understanding." He glanced up at me, and for once there was no clever retort, no sardonic smile. Only the weariness of a man who had unraveled the knot, but found no comfort in its loosening. That night, as I prepared for bed, I paused by the window, watching the rain return in soft strokes across the glass. Below, the lamps flickered gold in the mist. Somewhere out there, Elizabeth Carter had returned to her life quiet and unseen. Clara Morgan, too, had vanished into the great tide of London, perhaps bound for Spain, or perhaps not. The Aldridge name would continue, its legacy divided, its truths buried beneath polished marble and legal seals. But in our small sitting room on Baker Street, I felt something larger had shifted, something not confined to wealth, guilt, or inheritance. A reminder, perhaps, that even in a city of locked rooms and shadowed pasts, it is not always the crime that defines the tragedy. Sometimes it is the silence after. The next morning dawned with a thin, pearl-grey sky that hung low over London, like a shroud. Holmes rose late, an uncommon occurrence, and said nothing over breakfast, save for a perfunctory nod when I remarked on the weather. He seemed drained in a way I could not attribute to mere fatigue. His movements lacked their usual precision, his eyes unfocused, as though his mind were lingering somewhere just out of reach. I did not press him. There were moments in our shared life where silence said more than conversation. He had given everything. To the Aldridge case, his intellect, his instinct, his hours, and now in the aftermath, the weight of that effort pressed down like fog upon his shoulders. We were just beginning our second pot of tea when the knock came. It was not forceful, nor urgent, rather a hesitant, deliberate tap that suggested someone unsure whether they should be standing at the door at all. Mrs. Hudson answered, and moments later, a figure appeared in the sitting-room doorway, Cecil Aldridge. He had changed, not in dress, his coat and cravat were impeccable as always, but in bearing. The confident, half-bored air he'd once exuded had been replaced with something more grounded, and to my surprise, not altogether unpleasant. His eyes no longer flitted about the room in search of distraction. They met Holmes's directly. "I heard," he said, "about the letter, the one my uncle wrote to Miss Morgan." Holmes remained seated. "I assume you're referring to the one hidden behind the fireplace panel." Cecil gave a tight nod. "Braithwaite sent me word. Said he thought I should know." I glanced between them. "What exactly do you want, Mr. Aldridge?" He turned to me. Clarity, and perhaps some small redemption. Holmes gestured for him to sit, though his tone was clipped. "Then speak plainly. You've had too many opportunities already." Cecil sat, placing his gloved hands on his knees like a schoolboy awaiting judgment. "You were right. I went that night to confront him. About the will, about Clara Morgan. I was furious, not because of the money, at least not entirely, but because he never warned me. He rewrote our entire future without a word." "You wanted to scare him," Holmes said. "I did," Cecil admitted. I threatened to contest the will. I may have even said something about the press, about dragging Clara's name into the gutter. I wanted to force his hand, but he didn't respond with anger. He looked tired, resigned. Holmes tilted his head. And then? I left. I remember walking past the study window. I saw him sit back down, pour a drink, and stare at the fire. I told myself he deserved to suffer. Alone, betrayed, but I didn't kill him. No, Holmes said quietly. Pritchard did. I know that now, Cecil said. And I know I made it possible. I let the door stay open. I gave Pritchard the time and cover he needed, and I never once asked myself why he was so eager to help. Holmes studied him. Pritchard was a servant. He'd grown comfortable in the shadow of power. Clara Morgan threatened that. And you, well, you gave him the push he needed. Had you not come that night, it's possible your uncle might still be alive. Cecil flinched, but did not argue. I've come to ask what I can do, to make amends. Holmes leaned back. Your uncle's estate will now pass to its intended beneficiaries, the charitable trust, Miss Morgan. There is nothing to undo there. I'm not talking about money, Cecil said, his voice low. I'm talking about the name, the legacy. My uncle's death made headlines, but the truth hasn't. Most people still believe it was the maid, or that it was me, or that it was some foreign woman who seduced him. You and I both know that lies can rot a family faster than any scandal. Holmes's eyes narrowed. So you want the truth known? I want it recorded, Cecil said, even if it costs me. I've written a statement, everything I remember, everything I failed to say when it mattered. If you will read it and find it truthful, I'll submit it to the papers myself. Holmes said nothing for a moment. Then, to my astonishment, he reached out and took the folded sheet Cecil produced. He read in silence. When he finished, he laid it on the table. It is not without self-interest, but it is honest. Cecil nodded. That's all I can offer. Holmes stood. Then offer it. Let the name Aldridge carry a shadow, if only for a time. It is a small price for the truth. Cecil rose as well, hesitated, then offered his hand. Thank you, Mr. Holmes. Holmes did not shake it. Live better, Mr. Aldridge. That will be thanks enough. After he left, Holmes returned to his seat. I could tell something had shifted in him. Some small knot of tension had begun to unravel. It wasn't peace exactly, but perhaps the start of it. I cleared my throat. You believe him now? I believe he's finally telling the truth, Holmes said, or at least enough of it. There was a pause. You once told me, Holmes, that you preferred problems of pure logic, that sentiment and conscience were distractions. He gave a faint smile. And yet they appear in every case, do they not? As inevitable as rain in London. Sentiment, when examined properly, is merely motive in disguise. I laughed. You sound almost human. He chuckled once, softly. Then, I shall strive to correct the lapse. That evening, Holmes finished the letter I had seen him drafting days ago, a personal message this time, addressed not to the police or the press, but to Clara Morgan herself. He asked nothing of her, offered no counsel or platitudes. He merely wrote that her letter had been found, that her name had been cleared, and that her story would not be forgotten. He handed it to me to post, and said nothing more. As I stepped out into the crisp night air and dropped it into the box at the corner of Baker Street, I couldn't help but wonder where Clara was now, whether she had sailed back to Spain or remained hidden among London's quieter streets, whether she would open the letter with hope or grief, or both. When I returned, Holmes was at the window, his violin untouched, his gaze fixed not on the faitai world outside but inward, watching the slow settling of dust after a case that had shaken more than just the facts. And I knew then that for all his detachment and calculation, this one had reached him. Not because of the crime itself, but because of the way it had bent love and loyalty into silence. Because of the lives built in shadows and the courage it took, in the end, to bring them into the light. The following day brought a pale and reluctant sun, and with it a return to routine, or the semblance of it. Holmes had resumed his quiet habits, pacing between the desk and fireplace, reading the foreign dispatches with narrowed eyes, and dissecting the chemical content of a Turkish tobacco blend for reasons known only to himself. Yet something in his manner told me that the case of Lord Aldridge had not yet faded from his thoughts. That morning's post delivered 2 items of interest. The first, addressed to me in a careful hand, was from Elizabeth Carter. Holmes, seeing my surprise as I opened it, gestured for me to read it aloud. "Dr. Watson, I cannot find the words to thank you and Mr. Holmes for what you did. I left the city 2 days ago and am staying with an aunt in Kent, far from the eyes that once judged me. The news of Pritchard's arrest made it to the village already, but they don't speak of it with suspicion. They speak of it with sympathy. I've decided not to return to service. I've had enough of shadows and silence. Instead, I've enrolled in a modest training college for clerks. I want a life where I can stand by my own name. Please thank Mr. Holmes for me. I don't think he'd accept it from me directly, but I want him to know he didn't just save my life. He gave me back the dignity that was nearly taken from it. Yours, Elizabeth Carter." I folded the letter gently and met Holmes's eyes. "You've made a difference." He said nothing for a moment. Then, with a flick of his hand, he motioned to the second item from the post, a small parcel wrapped in cream-colored paper, tied with a red thread. I passed it to him. He examined it for a long moment before breaking the seal. Inside was a slim wooden box, and within that, a single silver locket on a delicate chain. No note, no return address. Holmes held it delicately by the chain and opened it. Inside, 2 photographs faced one another. One of Clara Morgan, young and serene, the other of a child, perhaps a boy of 3 or 4, with Aldridge's unmistakable brow and eyes. Tucked behind the lining was a folded scrap of paper, just 2 lines in. "A woman's hand, truth matters. Thank you for not letting it vanish." He closed the locket and returned it to the box. Neither of us spoke for some time. Later that day, we walked along the embankment. The air had grown colder, and the Thames moved sluggishly beneath the grey sky. Holmes was unusually quiet, hands clasped behind his back, gaze distant. I had seen him like this before, after particularly vexing cases, yes, but more often after those that touched on matters of the heart. He often pretended not to notice such things, but I knew better. The heart, while unmeasured by his instruments, left its evidence all the same. "I've been thinking," I said, "about what Lord Aldridge wrote, about the ledger, about how he tried to confess in fragments, letters, codicils, instructions that could be burned or missed." Holmes nodded slowly. The man spent his final months trying to outwit his own cowardice. He knew what Pritchard was capable of, knew that the truth once spoken would unravel lives, and still he tried, and failed. Only partially, Holmes said. He failed to stop the murder, but not to leave behind what mattered. We turned off the embankment and into the narrow streets of Westminster, where the soot-stained bricks and twisting alleyways seemed to shrink in the cold. Holmes stopped suddenly. "Do you remember, Watson, the first time we stood at a locked door together?" I smiled. "Brixton Road. The Raich case." Holmes gave a faint grunt of amusement. "Indeed, a study in false symbols and badly scratched walls, yet the principle remains. A locked room, a sealed past. They are never truly airtight. There is always some opening, some overlooked edge, and always someone willing to exploit it." He glanced sideways. "Or on occasion someone willing to expose it, even at a cost." I recognized the direction his thoughts were taking. "You mean Cecil?" "Cecil," Holmes agreed, "who, for all his failings, delivered his confession without a court summons. He could have left the city, could have denied everything, but he came to us instead." "You believe he's changed?" "I believe," Holmes said carefully, "that he's begun to understand the weight of legacy, the difference between inheritance and consequence." We continued walking in silence. The city moved around us with its usual indifference, cabs rattling past, chimney smoke curling into the air, shopkeepers shouting prices no one truly heard. It was the ordinary world again, returned to its usual tempo. Yet I felt its rhythm had shifted subtly since the Aldridge affair, not in the city itself, but in the people left in its wake. When we returned to Baker Street, a telegram was waiting. Holmes read it once, then handed it to me. To Holmes. Stop received. Your statement stop letter and ledger note deposited as record stop. Cecil formally relinquishes all claims. Stop Clara Morgan. Inheritance cleared. Stop. Aldridge matter. Closed. Stop. Braithwaite. Holmes gave a short, final nod and placed the telegram in the fire. The paper curled and darkened, and with it the last formal trace of the case vanished in a puff of smoke. That night, as the city drifted into slumber, I found Holmes in his chair, once again staring out at the street lamps through the narrow window. His violin rested untouched beside him. For a moment I thought to leave him to his thoughts, but he spoke, his voice low. "Do you think the boy in the photograph will ever know who his father was?" I sat down opposite him. "Perhaps not by name. But he'll know his mother, and through her something better than legacy, memory." Holmes considered this. "The truth," he murmured, "housed in memory, not in headlines or verdicts." "Sometimes," I said, "that's the only place it can survive." He nodded once, slowly, then leaned back and closed his eyes. Outside, the fog returned, soft and unhurried, and within the walls of 221B Baker Street, the silence that followed was not empty but whole, quiet, not from lack, but from the conclusion of something that had finally come to rest. The days that followed passed with little ceremony. The Aldridge affair faded from the headlines, replaced by newer scandals, newer crimes, each demanding its own moment in London's unrelenting rhythm. But at Baker Street, the quiet lingered longer. There was no final applause, no great triumph, only the slow closing of a door that had once seemed immovable. Holmes, true to form, resumed his peculiar routines as though nothing had shifted, yet something had. He no longer played the violin. Late into the night, nor spoke of Clara Morgan, Cecil, or the torn fragments of truth hidden behind velvet and fire. But I could tell it lived in him still, like a persistent thread caught beneath the weave of his thoughts. One afternoon, as autumn deepened and the wind scratched cold against the windows, I found him poring over an old casebook, one from years ago. He glanced up at me, and I saw that he had left the last page blank. "You never finished it," I said, recognizing the case by its outline. "I rarely do," Holmes replied. "The endings are yours to write, Watson. You bring them their shape." I took the seat across from him, my own notebook resting in my lap. "Shall I write this one too?" Holmes looked into the fire. "If you must." I nodded slowly, understanding. "Then let it end not with arrest, but with understanding. Let it end where all the damage began, with a lie undone." He said nothing for a time, then spoke as if to the flames. "The locked room was never the true puzzle. It was the locked heart. Pritchard hid his resentment behind servitude. Aldridge buried guilt beneath silence. And even Clara, she lived in the shadow of what could not be said aloud. I closed my notebook, and yet the truth was found. Pieces of it," Holmes said, "but never the whole. The whole truth doesn't exist, Watson. Only the parts people choose to tell, and the parts we choose to believe." There was something final in his tone, not resignation but completion. A week later, a modest notice appeared in the Times, a quiet announcement of a new charitable trust, funded anonymously, for the education of working-class girls seeking careers in law and clerical work. It bore no signature, but I knew its origin. Elizabeth Carter would not return to Belgrave Square. Clara Morgan did not return to Spain. Cecil Aldridge, by quiet arrangement, entered public service under a different name and served without distinction or disgrace. And the Aldridge estate, now divided and repurposed, lived on, not as monument but as recompense. As for Holmes, he returned to his instruments, to his monographs, to the strange comfort of the unresolved. He would always prefer problems with edges, crimes that could be measured in footprints and powder burns. But this case, I think, marked him in subtler ways. It marked me, too. For in that quiet library, behind a door no one could open, I saw more than just deduction. I saw a man, flawed, silent, tired, trying to set something right before it was too late. And another, brilliant and restless, refusing to let it end in silence, That more than the puzzle is what I chose to remember. And so, with the gas lamps flickering low and Baker Street settling once more into familiar stillness, I closed the ledger on the case of the maid who opened the locked room. Not with thunder, but with truth.